Gheorghe Mureșan was 7 feet 7 inches tall, had never lost a one-on-one bet in his professional life, and had just told a locker room full of reporters that Michael Jordan was, in his words, just a man. It was March 14th, 1996, at the United Center in Chicago, and the building smelled of concrete and decades of ambition. The crowd was already building noise before tip-off, 61,000 years of collective expectation compressed into 21,000 seats. And if you stood beneath the east baseline during warm-ups, you could feel the floor vibrating faintly, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The Bulls were 48-8. The Washington Bullets were going nowhere, and everyone in that arena understood the shape of the night except for one man, and he was the tallest person in the room. Gheorghe Mureșan was not naive. He was not uninformed. He was 23 years old, born in a Romanian village so small it had no traffic lights, a young man who had survived poverty and communist-era sports academies and the brutal machinery of European professional basketball, and he had emerged from all of it with the strangest possible gift. He was genuinely, completely unafraid of Michael Jordan. Not the dismissive bravado of a journeyman trying to psych himself up. Not the locker room theater of a veteran performing for cameras. Mureșan believed it with the clean, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had never been taught to believe otherwise. His logic was geometric and undefeatable in his own mind. He was 7 feet 7. Jordan was 6 feet 6. The mathematics of reach, leverage, and mass were simply on his side, and no amount of reputation could change the laws of physics. That morning, a reporter from the Washington Post had asked him directly whether guarding Jordan made him nervous. Mureșan had smiled the wide, unhurried smile of a man who has been asked a question with an obvious answer. He said, "I am bigger than him. I will take him on." The quote ran in the afternoon edition. Phil Jackson read it on the team bus and said nothing. Scottie Pippen read it and laughed. Michael Jordan read it and put the newspaper down without changing his expression, and that absence of expression was, to anyone who had been around him long enough, more frightening than anything his face could have produced. This is the story of what happened to a 7-foot giant who mistook size for safety. Mureșan had arrived in the NBA the year before as a novelty, the tallest player in league history, and he had proven himself to be more than a sideshow act. In the 1995-96 season, he was averaging nearly 11 points and 6 rebounds per game. He moved with more coordination than his frame had any right to produce. He had soft hands, reasonable footwork, a developing post game, and he had learned to use his height not as a blunt instrument, but as a spatial argument. If he established position, if he caught the ball in the right spot, the geometry of the game simply bent around him in ways that disadvantaged everyone else. He had blocked shots from players who were completely convinced the ball was going in. He had scored over smaller defenders with a patience that bordered on condescension. He was good. He was genuinely good. And he was about to spend 48 minutes learning what good actually looked like when measured against something else entirely. Jordan that night was 32 years old and 18 months into his second career. He had returned from his baseball sabbatical in March of 1995, played the final 17 games of that season with the rust of someone who had been gone too long, and then spent the following summer doing what Jordan always did, in moments of competitive humiliation. He converted the embarrassment into fuel and burned it clean. The 1995-96 Bulls were in the process of building what would become the greatest single-season record in NBA history, and Jordan was the engine of that machine in a way that transcended individual statistics. He was averaging 30 points per game. He was the defending scoring champion. He was also, and this matters more than any of the numbers, in a psychological state that his teammates described in consistent, slightly unsettling terms. Quiet, focused, deliberate. Steve Kerr would say years later that there were periods during that season when being near Jordan in practice felt like standing next to a current of electricity you could not see. You knew it was there. You could feel it on the edge of your skin. You did not want to test it. Jordan came out of the tunnel that night and moved through his warm-up routine with the economy of a man who had performed these same movements 10,000 times and had long since stopped needing to think about them. He moved to the corner and shot 15 pull-up jumpers. He caught 3 passes in the post and executed 3 drop-step moves to his right. He stood at the free throw line and made 8 of 10 with the practiced indifference of someone waiting for a delayed flight. When Muresan walked onto the court for Bullets warm-ups at the other end, Jordan did not look up. This was not a calculated slight. It was not theater. It was the simple reality that Jordan had already made his assessment and filed it, and nothing that happened during warm-ups was going to change what he had decided. 30 minutes before tip-off is when the script of that night was already written. The audience knew it. The floor felt it. Only one man in the building did not. The Bullets opened their offense in the first quarter with a moderate amount of confidence. The first 2 possessions went through Muresan in the high post, and he scored once on a short turnaround over a smaller defender, and the Bullets bench responded with enthusiasm, and Muresan nodded once with the measured satisfaction of a thesis being proven. His coaches had drawn up plays specifically designed to exploit his height advantage, get him the ball early, let him feel the game, let his body settle into the rhythm of the night. It was a sound strategy. It would have worked against almost any defender in the league. Jordan guarded him twice in the first 4 minutes, and both times gave him the ball without contest, backing off a half step, inviting the catch, allowing Muresan to feel comfortable, and then closing with a precision and timing that collapsed the available space before Muresan could fully gather himself to operate. The first time, Muresan pump faked, and Jordan did not move, and Muresan seemed momentarily confused by this, as if he expected the fake to produce the usual small advantage. The second time, Jordan anticipated the turnaround and disrupted the gather without fouling, and the ball came loose at a bad angle, and the possession died. Neither play resulted in a point. Neither play looked catastrophic. They looked like routine defensive sequences, and that was precisely the point. Jordan said nothing to Muresan during either possession. He pointed once to the spot where he wanted Muresan to catch the next inbound pass in the manner of a man directing traffic, and Muresan looked at him with an expression that crossed briefly between confusion and irritation before the whistle blew and the game resumed. Jordan was not defending Muresan, he was measuring him. The second quarter is where the arithmetic began to shift. Jordan started that period with 14 points, most of them coming in transition or in the mid-range game where his size advantage was irrelevant, and he had spent the first 12 minutes watching the Bullets' offensive structure, watching which players hesitated and which played with conviction, watching the specific way Muresan set up in the post and which direction he preferred to turn. Jordan had a quality that his coaches and teammates described in different ways, but always arrived at the same place. He could read the deep structure of a defensive scheme in real time, faster than most players could read it on a whiteboard, and he catalogued what he saw not as isolated observations, but as a complete map of the night's possibilities, already organized in a sequence that would allow him to access the right weapon at exactly the right moment. With 7 minutes left in the half, Jordan received a cross-court pass at the top of the key, with Muresan switching out to contest. Muresan was in position. He had the angle. He had the reach. He had every physical argument for making this a difficult shot, and he extended his enormous arm toward Jordan in the way he had extended it toward every smaller player who had tried to score over him, with the reasonable expectation that physics would settle the matter. Jordan went straight up. He released the ball at the top of his jump, the release point several inches above the practical maximum of his frame, perfectly vertical, no lean, no drift, and the ball went over Muresan's outstretched hand with a clearance that could not have been more than 3 inches, and it hit the back of the rim and dropped clean. Muresan's arm came down slowly. He turned and looked at the ball as it came through the net, and there was something in that look, something that was not quite recognition yet, but was the first molecular precursor of it, the first moment of genuine doubt, working its way into a framework that had never entertained doubt before. Jordan jogged back on defense. He did not look at Muresan. He was already thinking about the next possession. The halftime score was Bulls 53, Bullets 41, and Jordan had 22 points, and none of the people in that building with full knowledge of what was coming could say precisely when the breaking point would arrive. Only that it would. There is a specific quality to the third quarter of an NBA game when one team has already decided to take something personally. It is not visible in the statistics, not at first, not in the box score you read the next morning with your coffee. It shows in the pace of the game, in the tempo of the offensive sets, in the way certain players call for the ball in spots where they have decided the evening will be settled. Jordan came out of the locker room at halftime with 22 points and the particular looseness of a man who had been warming up for the first 24 minutes. His jaw was set in a way that Scottie Pippen later described as the quiet before a very specific kind of weather. This is the moment the game stopped being a game. The third quarter opened with a Bulls possession, and Phil Jackson called a play that everyone in the building understood was a direct statement of intent. Jordan isolation, right side, against whatever the Bullets sent at him. The Bullets sent Muresan. The crowd recognized this before either player moved, and the noise in the United Center shifted slightly in pitch, the way a room full of people shifts when something they have been waiting for is about to arrive. Jordan caught the ball on the right elbow. Muresan stepped forward to meet him, his arms wide, his enormous frame filling the available space in the way it filled every space it entered. Jordan stood with the ball at his hip and looked at Muresan for a full second, which in the timing of a basketball possession is not a second at all, but rather a geological era, and the arena went quiet in the way arenas go quiet when they want to hear the next sound more clearly. Jordan drove left. He had shown Muresan his right hand twice in the first half, and Muresan's weight had shifted incrementally to protect against it, the way any defender's weight shifts over the course of a game as the pattern becomes established. And Jordan had noted the shift and filed it in the same catalog where everything about this night was stored. And now he drove left, and Muresan was a half beat late, not because he was slow, not by any objective measure of human movement, but because Jordan was not operating at the speed of human reaction. He was operating at the speed of a system that had already processed the outcome and was simply executing the predetermined sequence. Jordan got to the rim. Muresan recovered with the commitment of a man who had decided he would rather foul than allow the layup, and he came across with both hands, and Jordan adjusted in the air, changed the angle of his body in a manner that should not have been physically available to him at that speed, and he laid the ball off the glass from the left side at an angle that required him to be in two positions simultaneously. The ball went in. The foul was called. The crowd exploded in the specific register reserved for the moment when the impossible makes itself ordinary. Jordan stood at the free throw line and looked at nothing. He bounced the ball 3 times. He made the free throw. He did not look at Muresan. He turned and jogged back on defense. Muresan stood near the basket for a moment longer than necessary. He put his hands on his knees. He was not winded. He was doing something else. He was running the play back internally, trying to locate the specific moment where the geometry had stopped making sense, trying to find the error in his reasoning that had allowed this to happen, and he could not find it. And that was the part that was beginning to feel like something other than a basketball game. 6 possessions later, Jordan came off a screen at the top of the key, caught the ball in space with Muresan closing from the weak side, and shot a pull-up jumper over the closing hand that was so perfectly timed, so completely anticipatory of the defensive geometry, that Muresan did not even fully extend before the ball was already released. He stood with his arm half raised and watched the arc of the shot, and it went in with the quiet authority of an argument that has been concluded. Jordan had 34 points with 4 minutes remaining in the third quarter. By this point in the evening, the dynamic of the game had shifted from competition to something closer to documentation. The Bullets were still playing. They were still executing their offense, still running their defensive rotations, still functioning as a professional basketball team in all the ways that mattered to the official record. But the players on that bench had adopted the particular posture of men watching something they will describe for the rest of their lives, something they will be asked about for years, something they understand even in the moment is not repeatable and will not come again. Jordan at this point in the season, in this particular configuration of focus and motive and physical capability, was operating at a frequency that the instruments of the game could barely measure. Excellence is not a talent, it is a temperature. With 3 minutes left in the third quarter, Jordan received the ball in the post with Muresan behind him. This was unusual. Jordan had spent the game attacking from the perimeter, using his quickness and his jump shot as the primary instruments of the evening. And now he had the ball in the paint with Muresan on his back, and Muresan felt the weight of Jordan against him and recognized this as the scenario his size was built for. And he planted his feet and pushed back with everything he had, because this was the argument he had prepared for. This was the physical conversation where the mathematics of reach and leverage were finally on his side. Jordan felt the resistance. He held the position for a beat. He leaned back into Muresan once, testing the weight, the way a man tests a door before deciding how to open it, and then he spun left, one pivot step, and the space that Muresan had been filling with his enormous body was suddenly empty, because Jordan was no longer in it. And the floater Jordan released from 8 feet traveled an arc that seemed to pause at its apex for a fraction of a second, a stillness above the chaos before it dropped straight through the net, as if the net itself had reached up to take it. Muresan watched the ball drop from behind Jordan, and in that moment, in the brief geography of the 3 seconds it took the ball to travel from Jordan's fingertips to the bottom of the net, something in Gheorghe Muresan's face changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way faces change in films when a character has a revelation. Quietly, the way light changes in a room when the angle of the sun shifts by degrees, you cannot name, but can see in the way the shadows fall. The confidence did not shatter. It dissolved. And dissolution is worse than shattering because you cannot point to the moment of impact, cannot locate the break, cannot argue that you were robbed. You simply notice all at once that the thing you were carrying is no longer there. Jordan's final line that night was 53 points. It remains one of the 20 highest scoring performances of his career, achieved in a regular season game in the middle of a championship run against a 7'7" opponent who had walked into the United Center that morning certain of the outcome. The final buzzer sounded in a building that was still vibrating with the frequency of what it had witnessed. Jordan toweled off near the bench and turned toward the tunnel without ceremony, without any visible acknowledgement of the number on the scoreboard or the reaction of the crowd or the figure of Gheorghe Muresan, who stood at half-court for a moment after the final whistle with the particular stillness of someone trying to understand the size of a landscape they have never seen before. The statistics: 53 points. He had known the statistics before tip-off. He had known the averages, the tendencies, the historical record. He had known all of it with the same confident certainty with which he had walked onto the court, and none of it had meant what he thought it meant. He understood now, in the quiet of the emptying arena, that there is a difference between knowing a fact and knowing what a fact feels like from the inside. He had known about Michael Jordan the way you know about weather from a forecast. He understood Michael Jordan now the way you know about weather when it has already soaked through your coat. Jordan, in the post-game locker room, was asked about Muresan. He toweled his forearms and thought for a moment with the particular honesty he applied to questions about opponents who had competed with real commitment. He said, "He plays hard, he plays physical. But there are nights when size is not the conversation." He left the sentence there and did not complete it, because the completion was already printed on the final scoreboard and required nothing further from him. Muresan would play 6 more years in the NBA before injuries ended his career. He would have good nights and productive seasons. He would post career-high performances and earn a Most Improved Player award. He would accomplish things that the vast majority of human beings who have ever held a basketball will never accomplish, and none of it would fully eclipse the specific weight of the night when the geometry he trusted had stopped working. Players who shared locker rooms with him in the years that followed said he did not speak often about Jordan, and when he did, he spoke with the measured respect of a man who has earned the right to use the word by having paid the tuition personally. There is no shame in that silence. There is something almost admirable about a man who looks at the full size of what he encountered and decides the most honest response is quiet. Jordan moved forward from that night without looking back, because he was already thinking about the next game, the next opponent, the next argument he had decided to make with his body and his will, and the 40,000 hours of practice and adversity that had been compressed into the specific weapon that existed behind his eyes. He was already somewhere else. He had been somewhere else before the buzzer sounded. This is the quality that separates the historically great from the merely excellent. Not the ability to play well, but the capacity to be finished with a great performance before the crowd has even processed it, to close the chapter in the same motion as the final act, to move forward so immediately and so completely that looking back becomes physically impossible. Jordan did not need the memory of 53 points. He was already thinking about 54. What the story of that night in Chicago reveals, once you step back from the basketball, is a principle that has nothing to do with jump shots and everything to do with the way human beings build the walls of their own limitations. Muresan did not fail because he was wrong about his size. He was right about his size. He did not fail because he lacked preparation or courage or professionalism. He failed because the specific kind of confidence he carried into that building was a confidence in a fact. And facts are always subject to revision when they encounter something operating on a different level of the same question. He believed in the logic of his physical measurements, and what he met was not a competing measurement but a different system of meaning altogether. Jordan's greatness was not a physical fact. It was a methodology. It was the product of a specific relationship with failure, with pain, with the gap between ability and aspiration, with the process of converting every instance of being underestimated into stored energy that he burned at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right direction, with the precision of a man who had spent years building a furnace in the place where other people kept their hurt. You cannot measure that in height. You cannot prepare for it with geometry. You can only encounter it and be changed by the encounter, and decide whether the change will diminish you or instruct you. Muresan was instructed. The arena was empty by the time the cleaning crew reached the east baseline. Someone had left a program open on a seat near mid-court, and a face stared up from it at the empty ceiling, and the empty ceiling did not stare back, because ceilings do not keep score. The score is kept in the bodies of the men who walked off the floor and carried the night into the rest of their lives. One of them carried it as proof of what he could become. One of them carried it as the beginning of an understanding, and the understanding was this: greatness is not measured in what you can reach. It is measured in what you refuse to accept as the limit of your reach. That is the only ceiling worth looking up at. And for Michael Jordan, that ceiling had not yet been found.